Welcome to Mindful Moments, packed with insights but designed to fit into your busy life.
All right, so we all learned that history goes ancient, medieval, modern, right. But does that way of looking at things really capture the whole picture when we try to understand cultures from all over the world and all different times? Is that framework really enough, or does it maybe sort of box us in?
That's a really great question. And, I think historians have been wrestling with that for a long time. That framework, it's comfortable, sure. But when you start to look at the really rich histories of cultures outside of that Western European tradition, like China or pre-Columbian America or all the incredible civilizations of Africa and Asia, it starts to fall apart a bit. You can see the seams, and historians have definitely called this out. They've pointed out these problems, but it's like, well, okay, if not that, then what? What's the alternative?
Yeah, exactly. If that old way of dividing things up isn't working anymore, then what do we use instead? Well, our sources this time around, they point us towards this guy, Oswald Spengler, and he had this whole idea about understanding history morphologically. So break that down for us. What does that even mean?
So Spengler, he wanted us to see history not as this single line, but more like a garden, right?
Oh,
A
wow.
garden full of all these different cultures, and each one is like a unique plant, like a unique organism. And each one has this kind of distinct personality. He calls it a soul, and that soul shapes everything about that culture, from their art and their religion to like their politics and even their science. And this plays out through their whole lifespan as a culture, from their rise to, their eventual decline. And these cultures, he thought, they were deeply connected to the actual physical place they came from and their like spiritual foundations.
A soul for a whole culture. That's kind of a mind-blowing idea. How do we even wrap our heads around that? What does that really mean?
Right. So he talks about this idea of a soul image and a life feeling that each culture has. It's basically the way a culture sees itself and its place in the universe. And he even says that each culture has its own like inner mythology with its own set of deities that represent different parts of this soul. It's really fascinating. But, and there's a big but, he points out that it's really hard to truly understand a culture that's very different from your own because, you're always looking at it through your own cultural lens.
Yeah, I get that. It's like, how do you say it? You can't really get a joke if you don't understand the culture it comes from, right? So, can you give us like a concrete example of how these soul images actually play out in history?
Totally. So let's think about the classical culture, ancient Greece and Rome, right?
Right.
Spengler says they had this totally different way of relating to history than we do in the West. They were all about the present moment, like super focused on the here and now. They didn't think about time the same way we do, with this long line stretching back into the past and forward into the future.
So, their whole experience of time was different. Like, they didn't even think about a timeline.
Exactly. And the sources point out this really interesting thing. Pre-Solonian Greece, like the very early period, they didn't leave behind a lot of specific dates or even names of individuals from that time. It's really different from, say, Egypt, where they had these super detailed records of their kings and queens going back thousands of years. This shows us how different their attitudes were towards the past, and even death. Egyptians, they seem to want to like conquer time, make themselves immortal through their records and monuments. But the classical world, they were all about living fully in the present.
Wow, that is such a stark contrast. It makes you really stop and think about how we take our own way of seeing time for granted. Okay, so another thing our sources talk about is this idea of an underlying, I don't know, like a symmetry in how these different cultures express themselves. Can you explain what that means?
So what Spengler noticed was that even though cultures might seem totally different on the surface, there are these really fascinating parallels in the forms they take. It's like they're all riffing on the same basic themes, but in their own unique way. He even compares it to math, like the theory of groups, which is all about finding those underlying structures and how they transform. He's suggesting that there might be these similar patterns in how cultures, these cultural organisms, develop.
So it's not about things looking the same on the outside, it's about the deeper structure, like how they're built.
Precisely. And you can see this when you compare, for example, what he calls the Faustian soul, which he associates with Western culture, and the Apollonian soul of the classical world. Those two soul images, they shaped how those cultures approached even something as, seemingly objective as math.
Wait, how can math be influenced by culture? It's just numbers, right?
Well, that's what's so fascinating. Spengler argues that classical math, because it was so tied to that Apollonian emphasis on visible limits, it was all about magnitudes, things you could directly see and measure. But Western math, that Faustian math, it was driven by this yearning for the infinite. And so it developed this idea of number as a pure relation, an abstract concept. It's like the Pythagoreans, they were obsessed with ratios, things you could actually see and touch. But then you have someone like Descartes and his crew, and they come up with algebra, which is all about these abstract relationships. It's not just about what they were counting, it's about the whole idea of counting itself. One was rooted in the concrete, the other was reaching for something beyond that. And that difference, it tells us a lot about their whole worldview.
That's a really cool distinction. So how about their ideas about space? Did they see that differently too?
Absolutely. So the Faustian soul, it has this fundamental symbol of limitless space, which drives us to explore, to push boundaries, to always look beyond the horizon. But the Apollonian soul, it was all about those visible limits, and it didn't really have a concept of space as something infinite. In fact, the ancient Greek language, it didn't even have a word for space the way we understand it. And their appreciation for landscape, for those vast, expansive views, it was way more limited than what we see in the West. Their world, for the most part, ended at the edge of their city, you know what I mean?
So they were like much more grounded in their immediate surroundings.
Yes, exactly. And this difference, it also affected how they saw things like will and force. The Faustian will, that drive to go out and do things, to exert power, it comes from that concept of limitless space. It's all about pushing outwards. And you see that especially in the Baroque period. But the classical focus was more on balance, on being in harmony, not on this outward projection of force.
Fascinating. And what about time? We were talking about how differently they experienced time before.
Right, so the classical world, they focused on the present moment. But the Magian culture, and then later the Faustian, they developed these more linear ideas about time, with a clear past and a future. And in the West, we're obsessed with this idea of progress, with mapping out history on these elaborate timelines. That's all a part of that Faustian worldview. And, this whole thing about cultural narratives and how they're structured, it reminds me of this YouTube channel called Mindful Moments. It's this AI thing that analyzes audiobooks, and it breaks down the stories and the ideas in a way that really gets at those deeper patterns.
Interesting. Okay, so we've seen how those different soul images lead to really different ways of understanding math, space, time, will, all these fundamental concepts. But our sources also talk about these surprising parallels, these homologies that pop up across these seemingly separate cultures. Can you give us some examples of that?
Yeah, for sure. Spengler makes these really interesting comparisons. For example, he says that Protestantism in the West and the Dionysiac movement in the classical world, they both represent this kind of passionate, individualistic rebellion against the status quo. He also compares English Puritanism to Islam because they both emphasize this strict religious and social order.
Wow, those are not comparisons you expect. That's pretty wild. What other kinds of parallels did he find?
Well, he also talks about how, like, in classical literature, the characters are often kind of flat. They're these idealized figures without a lot of inner conflict. But in Western literature, we love those complex characters with all their flaws and their struggles. It's like Plutarch versus Goethe. One is all about anecdotes and surface details. The other is digging deep into the psyche. And even in drama, the classical focus was on this static moment within the three unities, that whole idea of unity of place, time, and action. But Western drama, it's all about movement, about this unfolding of destiny.
So even the way they told stories reflects those deeper differences.
Exactly. And he talks about esoteric cultures, like the West, where artists and thinkers often feel like they're misunderstood, like they're ahead of their time. That's really different from classical culture, where things were more straightforward. You didn't need layers of interpretation to appreciate the art. And one of the coolest parallels he draws is between figures like Pythagoras, Muhammad, and Cromwell. He sees them as all representing the same kind of revolutionary energy, both religious and political, within their own cultures, even though they're separated by, like, centuries and completely different contexts.
It's kind of amazing to think about those figures as being connected in that way. Like they're all tapping into this same underlying force. It really makes you look beyond the surface.
I know, right? And then he talks about this concept called pseudomorphosis, which is when a younger culture adopts the forms and styles of an older, more dominant culture. And sometimes that can actually prevent the younger culture from finding its own unique voice. He uses the example of early Western art, which was super influenced by classical forms, and he suggests that maybe that actually delayed Western art from developing its own style.
So it's like the younger culture is trying to fit into a mold that doesn't quite fit and it kind of gets stuck.
That's a great way to put it. It shows that cultural development isn't always a straight line. It can be influenced and even, like, sidetracked by these outside pressures.
So, what have we learned? Well, I think it's safe to say that Spengler's ideas really challenge the way we usually think about history. This whole morphological way of seeing things, it gives us a much more, I don't know, like a richer, more nuanced way to understand how all these different civilizations are connected and how they each have their own unique journey. And it definitely blows up that old ancient medieval modern thing.
I completely agree. It encourages us to appreciate each culture for what it is, to see its value and its own special character, instead of judging it against some, like, universal yardstick of progress.
And it really makes you wonder, how could these insights change the way we look at what's happening in the world today? How much does our own Western perspective, our own cultural lens, prevent us from truly understanding other cultures that have totally different soul images?
Those are big questions, and I think they're worth asking.
Absolutely. So if this has, got your brain buzzing, we'd love for you to subscribe to the show for more deep dives into all sorts of mind-blowing ideas. And please share this episode with anyone who you think might enjoy a different perspective on history and culture. And if you're really intrigued and want to go even deeper down the rabbit hole, we'll include some links in the show notes to some related books and articles. And finally, here's something to ponder. Spengler, he had this cyclical view of history, right? So if the West has this Faustian drive towards the infinite, is it possible that this drive itself could lead to its own transformation or even maybe its decline? Think about it. Thanks for joining us.